The year was 1867, and the land had dried itself into a crusted graveyard of grass. Every creek on the prairie seemed to have shriveled into dust, every pond a shallow hollow lined with cracked mud. Out where the sun baked the horizon into a shimmering haze, a lone ranch sat stubborn as a scar, its fences sagging, its fields brittle, its owner working with grit, and a kind of hollow hope that tomorrow might bring rain. His name was Thomas Avery, though few used it. To the men in town, he was that fool rancher clinging to dying land. To himself, he was just a man trying to keep alive what his late father had built with blood and sweat. He'd been a soldier once, worn the blue of the Union, but the war had left him with nothing but a limp in his stride and a head full of echoes he wished he could silence. He had come west seeking quiet, but quiet here was sharp as a knife, lonely, dry, and unforgiving. That afternoon the sky lay flat and white, no clouds, no mercy. The trough was half empty, and he poured out the last bucket he dared for his horses. Their muzzles dipped greedily, tongues lapping with frantic thirst. He rubbed the neck of his oldest mare, Daisy, who leaned into his touch as though she could sense the weariness behind it. It was then he saw movement in the dust. At first he thought it a coyote staggering low and limping, but as the shape drew closer, he saw it was a man, crawling, dragging one leg uselessly behind him. His skin was dark with dirt and blood, hair tangled with sweat. An arrow stub jutted from his shoulder, broken off near the shaft. His chest heaved with ragged, desperate breaths. Thomas froze, hand drifting toward the Winchester propped against the trough. His first thought was danger. A wounded man out here rarely wandered alone. In this one, he was no drifter, no white settler. His face, his braids, the markings faintly smeared on his skin. He was a native warrior, a man from the very tribes Thomas's neighbors cursed in the saloons at night. The man lifted his head, lips cracked, eyes fever-bright. He whispered something Thomas didn't catch, then his body gave out, collapsing in the dirt like a sack of stones. Thomas stood rooted, torn in two. He could leave him. Let the sun finish what battle had started. No one would blame him. A white rancher tending to an Indian? His neighbors would call it treachery, foolishness. And yet, Thomas remembered the battlefields of Tennessee, remembered boys younger than himself lying in mud and blood, their eyes pleading for water with their last strength. He remembered giving his own canteen once to a gray-clad soldier dying behind enemy lines. The man hadn't lived long after, but his last word had been thank you. Thomas swore under his breath and moved. He knelt beside the warrior, slid an arm under his shoulders. The man groaned but did not resist. His body was hot with fever, his skin parched. Thomas dragged him closer to the trough, dipped his own tin cup, and lifted it to the cracked lips. The warrior's hands trembled as they closed weakly around the cup. Water spilled down his chin, darkening the dirt. He drank with a desperation that was almost frightening, then coughed, nearly choking. Thomas steadied him, gave him smaller sips until the breathing calmed. For a long moment, the man only sat slumped against the trough, eyes closed, throat working as if savoring the gift. Then he rasped a word in his own tongue. Thomas could not understand, but the tone was clear. Gratitude. The rancher stared at him, uneasy. The wound in the shoulder was bad, the broken arrow festering. He could try to pull it out, but infection might already be spreading. Still, he couldn't just let him bleed into the dust. He fetched a rag, tore it, and pressed it against the wound. The warrior winced, but did not fight him. A voice startled Thomas from behind. "You lost your damn mind, Avery?" Two men on horseback reined in by the corral. Neighbors, Earl Kettering and his younger brother. Hard men both. Earl spat tobacco in the dirt. "You ta keen in strays now? And red ones at that." Thomas stood slowly, squaring his shoulders. He was dying out here. Good. Earl shot back. One less raider to worry about. He shifted in the saddle, hand brushing the stock of his rifle. "You want to keep your land safe, you put a bullet in his skull before more of his kind come sniffing around." The warrior's eyes opened weakly, fixing on the stranger's. His hand twitched toward a knife at his belt, but he lacked the strength to even draw it. Thomas moved subtly in front of him. "You best ride on," Thomas said, voice steady though his heart hammered. "This is my place. What I do here is my call." Earl narrowed his eyes, then spat again. "Your call's gonna bring hell down on all of us." He yanked his reins, wheeled his horse. "Don't come crying when your barns are ash." The brothers rode off, dust rising behind them. Silence returned, heavy as lead. Thomas exhaled slow, then looked down at the man leaning against the trough. "Well," he muttered, "guess it's you and me now." He hauled the warrior inside the cabin, laying him on a cot near the hearth. His sister, Margaret, looked up from the sewing she'd been mending. Her face went pale. "Tom," she whispered, "what have you done?" He told her. She shook her head, lips pressed thin. "Kindness is one thing. Harboring one of them under our roof? If folks find out." "They already know," he said grimly. Earl saw him. Her eyes darkened with fear. "Then we're ruined." Thomas glanced at the still form on the cot, chest rising and falling shallowly. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I couldn't let him die." That night stretched long and restless. Coyotes howled from the hills, their cries mingling with the crackle of the fire. The warrior tossed in fevered dreams, muttering in his own language. Once, Thomas thought he caught the word father. Another time, a name, short, sharp, spoken with grief. Margaret sat by the window, rifle across her lap. "Every hoofbeat I hear, I think it's them," she said softly. "His people. Or, worse, our own neighbors." Thomas didn't answer. He sat at the table, cleaning his gun, though he knew if it came to hundreds, no gun would matter. Still, a man had to feel ready. The hours crept on. Shadows stretched long, then vanished into the dark. Thomas dozed in his chair, head jerking up at every creak of timber. Outside, the night was vast and empty, stars cold and sharp against the black. Just before dawn, silence broke. It began as a low hum of vibration through the earth. Then came the sound, distant, steady, like rolling thunder. Hooves. Many hooves. Thomas stiffened, rising to his feet. He stepped to the window, heart pounding. The horizon to the east glowed faint with the coming sun, and against it a great, moving mass swelled. Dust rose in a thick cloud, and within it shapes moved, riders, dozens, no hundreds, their outlines sharp in the breaking light. Margaret gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "Dear God!" Thomas felt his blood run cold. The sound grew, a drumbeat of war horses. Painted feathers caught the wind. Spears and rifles glinted in the dawn. They were coming. The rancher's throat tightened. He had given water to one man. Now the whole tribe rode for his door. The warrior on the cot stirred, eyes fluttering open, his gaze fixed on Thomas, and for an instant something like sorrow passed there. He whispered a single word, too faint to catch, then closed his eyes again. Thomas gripped the window frame, jaw clenched. The prairie trembled under the storm of hooves. And in that moment, with the sun rising red behind them, Thomas Avery could not tell if his act of mercy had saved his family or doomed them all. The ground shook as the riders drew near, the sound of their approach rattling dishes on the shelf, quivering the water in the trough outside. Dust billowed across the prairie like a storm rolling in, blotting out the horizon. Thomas stood rigid at the window, every muscle locked, his fingers pressed white into the wood. His sister clutched the rifle to her chest, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Then they were upon the ranch. Horses fanned out in a great arc, circling the cabin and corral, their nostrils flaring steam in the cold dawn. Painted bodies gleamed with sweat, feathers snapped in the wind, the smell of dust and horseflesh choking the air. Warriors raised rifles, spears, bows, each motion deliberate, a show of strength that said they could strike in an instant if they willed. Thomas swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He'd been in battles before, but this was worse. In war, you had comrades at your side. Here he was one man, his sister, and a wounded stranger who had dragged fate to their door. A figure broke from the mass and rode forward. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, his presence commanding. A chief, no doubt, wearing a breastplate of bone and a headdress that spilled down his back like a river of feathers. His horse snorted, pawing the dirt as he brought it to a halt within yards of the porch. The chief's eyes were dark as obsidian, steady, unreadable. He spoke in his tongue, the words rolling deep and sharp. One of the younger riders translated, his voice accented but clear. "You gave water to a son of the Cheyenne. Why?" Thomas stepped onto the porch, every instinct screaming to run back inside, yet he forced himself steady. He let his rifle hang loose by his side, barrel down. "Because he was dying," he said simply. The chief regarded him in silence. The air felt brittle, every second stretching taut, like a rope ready to snap. Margaret stood just behind Thomas, her breath shallow, her eyes never leaving the warriors encircling them. The young translator repeated Thomas's words to the chief. A murmur rippled through the riders. Some scowled, some spat into the dirt. Others nodded, grave, as if they understood. The chief dismounted with the slow dignity of a man who had no need to fear. He walked past Thomas without a glance and entered the cabin. Margaret gasped but dared not move. Inside, the chief paused by the cot where the wounded warrior lay. The younger man opened his eyes, weak but alive. Recognition lit his gaze. His lips moved faintly, speaking the chief's name. The old man knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his son's chest. For the first time, Thomas saw emotion flicker in those hard eyes, relief, sorrow, pride. The chief straightened, turned back toward Thomas, and spoke again. The translator said, "You gave him life. For that, the Cheyenne do not strike you down." Thomas felt his knees want to buckle in relief, though his face betrayed nothing. He inclined his head. "I did only what any man should do." The chief studied him another long moment. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt, drew out a small carved token of bone, an eagle etched with careful hands, and pressed it into Thomas's palm. "This," the translator said, "marks you as one who showed honor." With that, the chief barked an order. The riders wheeled their horses, as one, the sound like thunder breaking. Dust rose, the ground trembling beneath the power of their retreat. In moments they were gone, swallowed back into the prairie as though the earth itself had birthed and reclaimed them. Silence rushed in behind them, heavy and strange. Margaret slumped into a chair, her hands shaking. "Sweet Lord above," she whispered, "I thought we were finished." Thomas stared at the token in his hand, its smooth edges warm from the chief's grip. He didn't understand its weight, not yet, but he knew it mattered. The hours that followed carried no peace. Word spread quick as prairie fire. By evening, half the settlement seemed to know what had happened. Men gathered at the saloon, voices sharp with outrage. "They'll be back," Earl Kettering spat, slamming his mug on the counter. "You don't ride out 100 strong just to hand over a trinket. They're sizing us up." Others muttered agreement. Fear had a way of feeding itself until it turned into anger, and anger needed a target. Thomas Avery's name rose on their tongues like a curse. 2 nights later, Thomas rode into town for supplies. He felt the stairs prickling his back as he hitched Daisy outside the general store. Inside, conversation hushed the moment he stepped through the door. The storekeeper, a wiry man with a permanent frown, stacked sacks of flour with jerky movements. "We ain't got much left for the likes of you, Avery," he muttered. Thomas frowned. "For the likes of me? You're making bedfellows with Injuns," the man hissed. "You'll bring ruin on us all." Thomas bit back his temper. He gathered what little the man would sell him and left. Outside, Earl and 2 others waited by the trough, their hands never far from their gun belts. "You ought to clear out," Earl said, stepping close. His breath stank of whiskey. "Sell your land, leave before the fire comes. If you don't, it'll be on your head when folks start dying to—" Thomas stared at him, jaw tight. "This land's mine. My father's blood is in it. I won't run." Earl's eyes narrowed. He leaned in, his voice low. "Then you'll burn with it." The punch came fast. Thomas staggered back, tasting blood on his lip. A second blow caught his ribs. He swung in return, fist crunching against Earl's jaw. The other men lunged in, fists flying. It turned into a blur of pain, boots scuffing dirt, curses spat through clenched teeth. Thomas hit the ground hard. The air knocked from him. A boot swung for his ribs, but he rolled, catching the man's ankle, toppling him. He scrambled to his feet, fists raised, chest heaving. Then a rifle cocked. The sound froze them all. The sheriff, a gaunt man with eyes like a tired hawk, stood on the boardwalk, his Winchester leveled. "That's enough," he barked. "Avery, get on your horse. The rest of you, back to your whiskey before I toss you in the cell." Grumbling, the men backed down. Thomas spat blood into the dust, mounted Daisy, and rode hard out of town. His ribs ached with every breath, his knuckles split and raw. But worse than the pain was the weight settling on him. The knowledge that his neighbors hated him near as much as the tribes feared him. That night he sat on the porch, staring out across the endless prairie. The carved token lay on the table beside him, catching the firelight. Margaret joined him, her face soft with worry. "You can't fight both sides, Tom," she said quietly. "No man can stand in the middle of a storm and hope to stay dry." Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the stars prick through the black sky, each one sharp, distant, untouchable. His voice, when it came, was low. "Maybe not, but I ain't about to stop being a man just because others lost the meaning of it." Inside, the wounded warrior stirred again, fever breaking at last. He whispered in his own tongue, words Thomas couldn't understand but felt in the weight of them. Thomas leaned back, rubbing his bruised ribs, the prairie wind brushing his face. He was caught between worlds now, and both eyed him with suspicion. Yet somewhere deep, beneath the ache and fear, a new resolve began to burn. For the first time in years, he felt his choices mattered. And that knowledge, heavy as it was, kept him awake until dawn painted the sky. The weeks that followed moved slow as tar in winter. Each day, Thomas mended fences, hauled water, tended the livestock, all with the sense that unseen eyes lingered just beyond the horizon. Every crack of twig, every stir of the wind in the grass made Margaret lift her head in fright, rifle never far from reach. The wounded warrior, the weak mended, fever sweated out of him, leaving behind a lean resilience that seemed carved into his bones. He spoke little, and Thomas understood even less, but the man's gaze carried weight. Sometimes in the hush of evening, when Margaret hummed a hymn by the fire, the warrior would watch her with something like wonder, as though the sound was both foreign and sacred. By the third week he stood on his own. He tied back his hair, sharpened his knife with deliberate care, and though he spoke no English, he placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder one morning and nodded once. Gratitude needed no translation. Then, without warning, he was gone. Thomas woke to find the cot empty, the door open, and tracks leading out across the prairie. Margaret stared at them, pale with worry. "He'll bring them back," she whispered. Thomas looked at the trail until it vanished in the grass. His gut twisted with uncertainty. Had he saved a man who would betray him? Or had he planted a seed of something larger than mistrust? Days passed. The neighbors grew restless. Men muttered in the saloon that Avery's ranch would soon be crawling with painted riders. Some sharpened their blades, others loaded their rifles, certain blood was on the wind. It came in the fourth week. The sound rolled first, low, steady, unmistakable. Margaret's sewing fell from her lap. Thomas rose from the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon. Dust swelled again, a storm of hooves. The prairie shivered with the weight of it. Riders emerged like a living tide, more numerous than before. Rifles glinted in the dawn, war paint slashed across stern faces. The neighbors had been watching, waiting. By the time Thomas saddled Daisy and rode out to the edge of his property, Earl Kettering and a knot of armed settlers had gathered, their horses restless, their mouths set hard. "They're comin' for blood," Earl growled. "This is it, Avery. You drew M here." Thomas tightened his reins. His ribs still ached from Earl's fists, but his voice carried steady. "You shoot first, you'll bring a war we can't win. You think they ride this many just to hand you flowers?" Earl spat. The riders slowed, fanning into a crescent across the prairie. At their center rode the chief again, feathers streaming in the wind. But this time he was not alone. Beside him rode the man Thomas had saved. Whole, strong, his wound healed to a scar. His chin lifted with pride as he guided his horse forward. The chief dismounted. Dust swirled at his boots as he walked toward Thomas, who slid down from Daisy and met him halfway. Behind them, settlers fingered their triggers, warriors lifted their spears, the air stretched taut as a bowstring. The chief spoke. The younger translator from before rode forward, his eyes flicking between both groups. "The one you saved is my son. He lives because you gave him water when death had nearly claimed him. For that, your blood is sacred to us. No hand here will harm you." Gasps rose among the settlers. Earl snarled, "Sacred my ass. They'll gut us the moment we turn our backs." The chief ignored him. His son dismounted, approached Thomas, and in a gesture that carried the weight of ceremony, held out a flask of water. The leather was worn, the stopper sealed with sinew. The warrior placed it in Thomas's hand, his voice quiet but clear in accented English. "You gave me water. I give back. My life, my people's honor." Thomas's throat tightened. The flask felt heavier than iron, though it held only water. He understood. This was no trinket, it was a covenant. The chief turned to the settlers, his voice hard. The translator spoke. "This ranch is under the protection of the Cheyenne. If any man raises rifle against it, he raises rifle against us." A hush fell, broken only by the snorts of uneasy horses. Earl's face twisted red. "You can't mean—" But the rifles of 100 warriors shifted as one, the sound like a storm gathering. Earl fell silent. Thomas stood in the eye of it all, heart hammering. He looked at the settlers, his own people, though they glared at him as though he'd betrayed them. He looked at the warriors, fierce and proud, who had come not with vengeance, but with a vow. He raised the flask high, his voice steady. "No more blood," he said. "Not here. Not now. Not ever, if I can help it." For a long breath, no one moved. Then the chief nodded once. He mounted his horse, his son beside him. With a cry, the riders wheeled away, thunder rolling as they vanished back into the sea of grass. The settlers shifted uneasily. No cheers rose, no thanks were given. Earl spat into the dirt and glared at Thomas. "You think you won something here? All you did was mark yourself. You're theirs now. You'll never belong to us again." One by one, the settlers turned their horses and rode off, leaving Thomas standing alone in the settling dust. Margaret came to his side, her face pale, but her eyes bright with something fierce. "You did right," she said softly. "Right seldom wins you friends, but it leaves you a man you can live with." Thomas looked down at the flask in his hand, the carved token still resting in his pocket. He thought of the son's eyes when he offered the water, of the chief's pride and sorrow, of the way neighbors he'd known for years now looked on him as a stranger. That night he sat by the fire, Margaret quiet beside him, the prairie wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. He turned the flask over and over in his hands, the firelight catching on its worn leather. The frontier was a place of lines, between survival and ruin, between hate and mercy, between one people and another. He had stepped across one of those lines, and nothing would ever be the same. But for the first time in years, Thomas felt the weight of his choices not as a burden, but as a kind of strength. He had stood between two storms and found, somehow, a place to plant his feet. He lifted the flask to his lips. The water inside tasted of leather and earth and something else, something older, something binding. It was the taste of life given back. He set it down, staring into the flames. "Maybe," he murmured, more to himself than to Margaret, "the hardest fight ain't with bullets at all. Maybe it's with the part of you that wants to hate, when mercy is the harder road." Margaret reached across the table, her hand warm on his bruised knuckles. Neither spoke again. The fire burned low, the night stretched long, and outside the prairie lay quiet. In years to come, the neighbors would whisper. Some would say Thomas Avery was a fool who lost his place among his own. Others would tell the tale different, that he was a man who bridged a chasm with nothing but water and will. But for Thomas, it was simpler. He had faced death on his land and answered with life. And that, he reckoned, was enough. So, what do we take from this tale? Perhaps only this, that in a land where steel and powder ruled, mercy was the rarest weapon of all. It cost more than a bullet, demanded more than a blade, and yet it could change more than any victory won in blood. If this story struck a chord, share it, carry it, pass along. For the frontier was not only battles and graves, it was choices and the men and women who dared to make them. And in the end, that is the only legacy worth telling.